Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Just like to say thank you for tuning into another episode of Finding Light with me, Brad Carr. I'd also like to express my gratitude for those people who have left comments and sent me messages in appreciation of the podcast that I've filmed so far. Your comments help me to keep going sometimes. I often feel stuck and, like I'm banging my head against a brick wall with this thing. So to see comments and messages come through and people leaving me, some beautiful words with regards to the work that I'm doing for photography as a whole, for humans as a whole. It just means the world to me, really, to hear that, it's raising questions within people who are reflecting on their own lives and perhaps going a little bit deeper into their own stories and maybe increasing their own awareness around themselves and what they're doing here. So everybody, thank you very much for your comments. I'd also like to just remind people that if they are interested in the upcoming residential workshop in 2024 with myself and Mark Robbins in Snowdonia, then we have just 3 places remaining. So if you've been thinking about it, then maybe now is the time to take the plunge and contact us with your interest. For now, I'm going to leave you with the next episode of the podcast, which is a beautiful conversation with Murray Livingston, who is predominantly a black and white photographer. He's based down in Oxfordshire, regularly photographing around the UK and further afield sometimes, but he loves Scotland, and you'll hear why in this episode, which covers plenty of ground, as always. So I'd like to invite you to make yourself comfortable, grab yourself a drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with myself and Murray Livingston. Murray.
Fantastic. Hey, Brad.
Happy to be here?
Yeah, very happy.
Thank you for coming down all the way from
Oxfordshire.
It's
2.5-3/4 hour.
Yeah, and a beautiful drive.
Yeah,
you mentioned.
Mostly in the dark, but
for the last half an hour. Yeah,
a sunrise that was worth getting up for sure.
How did Mid Wales look this morning?
Surprisingly dry.
Yeah.
I was expecting to be driving in the rain all the way with the storm coming through, but
yeah. You've come on a good day because we've had road closures galore over the past 2 days. Yeah. And a journey that would normally take me about 10 minutes would take me an hour because I was here, there and everywhere.
Okay.
And we're not blessed with an abundance of roads here. It's mostly country lanes and farmers' tracks, but you made it, so I'm very glad.
Absolutely.
And what a sunrise to come over to, yeah?
Yeah, it's maybe an auspicious start to a bit of a trip that I'm going on now.
Yeah.
So,
are you heading to...
Up to Scotland for a month and a half.
Yeah.
And some sort of big-ish plans. I'm actually going up to try and do the Hebridean Way.
All right.
Which is a 250 kilometre through hike.
Right.
So you go from the very south of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland all the way.
Which are the outers? Is that...
That
Harrison and Lewis?
Harrison and Lewis are sort of the northerlymost.
Yeah.
And then you go through the Uist, Berneray, Fattersay.
Right.
Probably a bunch of islands that most people have never really heard of or thought about.
Well, that's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
For photography.
Absolutely.
You'll be seeing unique images, hopefully, yeah?
Yeah, that's the hope. And a lot of the places that I've never been to. I've been out to Harris a few times.
Yeah.
But the southern section of the Outer Hebrides being my first time.
Have you got your eyes on any portfolio kind of ideas in mind?
So I'm potentially hoping to do a little bit of a project with it.
Yeah.
I've applied for some Arts Council funding.
All right.
So fingers crossed that comes through.
Yeah.
And then that can sort of go through into doing a bit more work and getting into the darkroom to do some printing with the images that I make on the hike.
Nice.
So I mean, there's like a lot of things that could potentially happen.
Yeah.
Depending on if I get the funding.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to try and make the most of it no matter what.
Are you going with any expectations in mind, or are you completely open?
No, I'm pretty open. I've done very little in the way of sort of specific location scouting.
Yeah.
Other than trying to find places to wild camp.
Oh yeah.
Just so I can actually have like a few options for mainly just for safety and comfort.
Yeah.
And trying to align those with areas that I think might be interesting.
Yeah.
Usually not something that I do trying to set expectations, because half the time, things
Yeah.
either don't go how you thought they would. But I also find that it sort of sometimes leaves me a bit closed-minded if I do that. Whereas if I show up and am just open to finding whatever's out there, noticing how the light's playing that morning, or if the winds are gusting, and then trying to make the most of those specific conditions, or just how I'm feeling that morning.
Yeah. So it leaves you kind of adapting to the landscape rather than trying to make the landscape adapt to who you are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I try to do is definitely have like more of a conversation with nature.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to impose like my vision of what I think it should look like.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely like a two-way conversation trying to go on there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of my approach generally over the past year or 2 years has been, I have almost two approaches. So, but the one that's been predominantly kind of reigning over me has been the one where I've gone somewhere and I've kind of visualized and projected what I want something to look like, but it doesn't necessarily lend to the most satisfying experience compared to when I go somewhere with nothing in mind and I'm reactive and present and fully engaged.
I think there's a time and a place for both. Like, I mean, for instance, if you're crafting a portfolio or a project or in a certain location, then you might look at a body of work and say, oh, it really needs this kind of image. I really need, in this little section, I need a lone tree and fog or something. And in that case, then maybe you go out specifically trying to craft something.
Yeah.
But I think even if you do that, or even if I do that, and I go out into the landscape looking for lone trees or characterful trees or something like that, even you go and you find that particular subject, you're still going to have, when you find that subject, that sort of moment where you think, oh, is this angle better? Is that
sure.
Trying to work on the composition. So in that little moment there, you're having that form of the conversation that I was talking about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And even sometimes when we're so fixated on something, the expectations, quite often in life in general, not just in photography now, but don't actually match up to what we've projected in our minds. Being creative people are always imagining things to be, I guess, sweeter than what they might be. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's part of it as well. Just being okay with whatever comes your way and making the most of it.
Yeah. And that certainly reflects in your work. There's quite a few images that I've seen recently that are just, you can sense this complete reactiveness and complete kind of you're seeing it in the moment. Particularly there's a black and white image that's anchored, it's pinned to the top of your profile, and it's one of the first ones I saw when I was introduced to your work actually, and I kind of took a step back and thought, okay, this is pretty awesome and pretty different, as well as the one, the fog hanging low with
the sun coming through
all the clouds.
That was a pretty spectacular moment. And I suppose, the bigger story behind that is it's at the top of the most remote mountain in Scotland. Right. So it's about a 25-kilometre hike just to get there. Right. Over the course of, some people can do it in a day. I'm not quite at that level. Yeah. I did it over the course of 3 days. Right. Sort of wild camping on the way.
So that's not just a straight hike, that's kind of up and down.
Yeah. It's pretty remote. Yeah. But that's part of the experience for me is like so rich behind that photograph. Yeah. And basically, we got up to the top of that where I was doing it solo, and there was a few other photographers as well. Yeah. Who happened to be there at the same time. And the whole day was super hazy. Basically, you couldn't use a polarizer to cut through anything. It was just like a flat landscape. Everyone was super, sort of almost a little bit down on themselves, packed all this way that things going to happen, which is part of that expectation thing, right? And then starts to come towards sunset, that sun lowers and it changes the way that the conditions are playing. And all of a sudden I'm starting to think, if that sun comes lower and it starts coming through all that atmosphere, we're going to have something really special. Yeah. And the photograph that you're talking about has got that one moment that happened for about 3 seconds. Yeah, wow. It was the sun was actually visible through that low cloud.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like one of those memories that's going to live with me.
Full emotion.
For the rest of my life.
Yeah. Would you say that those are your moments of presence, of being here in the moment and nothing else going on upstairs? Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like pure intuition.
Yeah.
And just being in that moment.
Yeah. Well, I've had interesting conversations about this recently, actually, about that kind of idea of intuition and reactiveness and impulse and flow, and that's pure creativity, isn't it? Do you think?
I think it is, but I think there's also there's opportunity to sort of train your intuition, if you like. There's perhaps in photography especially a bit of a dichotomy that people sometimes pose, where there's intuition and then intention, and I think there's probably a bit more of a grey zone that I like to sort of live in, where there is an intention behind what I'm doing, and it's not just pure reaction.
Yeah.
I'm aware of composition and aesthetic, all that sort of things. And to some extent, when I'm there making an image, I'm also thinking about how am I going to process this?
Yeah.
What would it look like in print, etc., etc. But I'm living in that moment of that image and that scene. But for me, it has sort of a wider life. It's not just about that moment. It's about what life is that photograph going to take on.
Yeah. Do you have a process afterwards of kind of reflecting on that photograph and the rest of your photographs and maybe reflecting, because in that moment, the 3 seconds you can't look at it and it can't make sense in that moment to what it means to you. So what's your process after taking images there? A reflection process, an introspective process?
It generally is a case of leaving the images for a little while.
Right.
Most of the time, I would say. Occasionally, there's an image that I take where I'm just like really excited and I want to see what it looks like on the computer. Most of the time, I would say though, it's a case of letting it sit and detach somewhat from the experience. Just so that I can bring a bit more of that objectivity and intention into the process. Otherwise, I think maybe sometimes I get a little bit wrapped up in trying to attach my own experience to the photograph. And at the end of the day, if you're showing your work to other people, you've got to be able to clearly communicate those things through the photograph. And having a bit of objectivity, I find, helps me to say, or to look at it from that second perspective and say, if I was someone who just saw this image for the first time, what's my eye going to? What's the story that's going on in this photograph? What does it tell me about the artist, etc.? So just trying to really sort of self-critique both the image itself and all the things that go around creativity in my photography. Big proponent of self-critique, self-reflection. And really being introspective.
Yeah. When you say self-reflection, are you meaning, what's gone into that in terms of your own life, or you mean reflecting and critiquing the image itself from a technical standpoint?
It's a bit of both. And I think one sort of feeds into the other in a lot of ways. And it could be, for instance, on that hike or on lots of hikes, you're not in the right mind space sometimes. For instance, out in South Africa, where I'm originally from, I carried a big, large format camera up the mountain.
Right.
And basically I hiked way too fast. By the time I got to where I wanted to take some images, I was like absolutely done. Just exhausted. And the reflection of that experience was like, I need to be able to be within myself when I'm going on these hikes, on these walks, in order to be able to be creative. So there's a bit of it that is sort of self-reflection, and there's also the side of things that's maybe a bit more on the technical aspect.
So I was going to ask, would you say you're predominantly shooting from an emotional standpoint than a logical? Obviously, you kind of answered that question saying there's a bit more of a blend going on between the two,
Yeah, it's a blend. I would say at capture, it's probably more on like the emotional side, and then in post-production and everything, then it leans towards the other end of things.
Yeah.
While still trying to maintain that like essence of the emotional experience and convey that experience to other people.
Yeah.
That's sort of, I guess, the primary goal of my photography in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Is wanting to share those kinds of moments at whatever it is, at the top of mountains or on beach sides.
Yeah.
First thing in the morning. Wanting to share those like beautiful soul enriching moments that you have in life with other people.
Yeah. Why would you say you want other people?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I think, I've had sort of first-hand experience of this, going to work in a big city.
Yeah.
Getting a job 9 to 5.
Yeah, sure.
Nowadays most jobs not 9 to 5
till 5:30. Mine was
yeah, or longer.
Yeah.
And I don't find that life fulfilling. And what I have found most fulfilling is those sorts of experiences out in nature.
Yeah.
I studied architecture at school, and so I had a lot of, at school I had heaps of stress from that, and then afterwards I went and worked in London.
Yeah, wow.
And 100-hour weeks were pretty commonplace.
That's crazy. And that's in an office?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was doing that in university as well, just because in architecture that's sort of almost what's required.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, photography was actually sort of something that provided a bit of balance to that life.
Yeah.
And through that process of self-reflection, I guess I kind of realised that photography was the thing that actually I was enjoying most.
Is it photography that you think you belong in, or is it nature? Does that make sense?
I agree with you, it's definitely nature.
Yeah.
And photography is a way of communicating that with other people, and a way for me to have, as I mentioned earlier, that conversation with nature.
Yeah, sure.
Through the lens, or that experience of looking through a viewfinder, and just it's sort of you and that little section of the world, and everything else doesn't
exist. Yeah. Is there an element then of you maybe trying to use your own experiences with working those kinds of jobs in cities, and where I don't feel like we do belong as a species, not just as photographers and creative people, but as a species. So is there an element of maybe you trying to fight a bit of a fight and get people back to nature?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, too many people have either never had those kinds of experiences out in nature, or are having fewer and fewer of them nowadays. I think that's just sort of a part of modern life these days, with urbanization and millions of people more and more people moving to cities every year, right?
Yeah.
And I think, the more that people are disconnected from nature physically, the more they care, or the less they care about it.
Sure.
So giving people the opportunity to come out and have those experiences, I think hopefully will make people just care a little bit more about the world. Right?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that would lead overall to a happier, whatever you describe happier, but maybe a more functional world.
Yeah.
If we all had a little bit of, closeness with nature. I know certainly with my work, a lot of it is about, deepening our own empathy for the world and therefore ourselves and therefore each other, I think. I certainly feel like that is my sole reason for creating. So
yeah, that's an interesting point. It's sort of, I guess if you don't care about yourself, how can you care about the world at a bigger scale?
Yeah. Because we see the world as we are, essentially, don't we? Right?
Yeah. Sort of, you do see most things sort of through your mind's eye, right?
Yeah.
You've got your own unique perspective built from all of your previous experiences and everything.
Yeah. That leads me on really nicely to another question, actually, because I've talked a lot to other people who've come on about previous experiences in life, and particularly adversity that may have pushed us into landscape, and I'm wondering are there any particular experiences that you can draw back on in your life that you feel may have shaped you as a person and shaped your vision and shaped the sensitivity with which you see the world and nature particularly?
Yeah, for sure. I sort of briefly touched on the architecture side of things and those crazy long hours.
Yeah.
But I guess more specifically at university, I did an undergrad and a master's at Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And basically, I think by the third year, I was pretty much burned out.
Yeah.
I got mononucleosis.
You'll have to enlighten me, and maybe other people as well.
Epstein-Barr virus. They call it like kissing disease.
Oh, I don't know. Never heard of that.
There's another. There's got a whole bunch of names for it.
Right.
It's very common, but sort of
not in Wales apparently.
Yeah. Very common amongst like sort of early 20s. And it's something you usually get once, and then you never get it again for the rest of your life. I got a seriously bad case of it where I had that and tonsillitis at the same time. Ended up being hospitalized.
Right.
And it's something that attacks your immune system.
Right.
And it's very triggered by stress.
Yeah.
In my case, it sort of reoccurred quite a few times. And that was sort of quite a big wake-up call for me. Of like, what I'm doing is just causing me stress.
Yeah.
And like, actually causing me quite a bit of internal pain and anguish.
Sure. Yeah. Body knows, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. You know.
Yeah.
There are days where like end up just in bed because physically can't do anything.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, as I said, photography brought that bit of balance back into my life, and nature brought that balance back into my life.
And were you practicing photography back then?
So I was a little bit. Not for the first couple of years of university.
Sure. Probably wise. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that was part of it. Was I had previously studied like film photography in high school.
Okay.
So I had a love for it.
Yeah.
And I went to university, and it was like, okay, focus everything on what I'm
sure.
going to be studying. And I think going back to eventually then picking up another film camera for like $50 from a secondhand thrift store kind of thing.
Yeah.
But even just that gave me that sort of purpose to go out and yeah.
And you picked that up in university while you were...
Yeah. It was probably halfway through second year.
Okay.
So sort of just before I got quite ill.
Yeah.
And the illness then was like, you really do need this in your life, and you need to focus on that and make it a bit more of a priority.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I wonder if your mind actually knew, your subconscious knew before your body actually knew that actually I need something else in my life, and maybe that's what, I don't know, maybe that's what drove you to...
I think you're right.
Pick the camera up, Really interesting, isn't it, the study of the mind and how much the mind knows.
I think what was, for me as well, what was interesting was I didn't immediately jump to doing landscape or nature. Even though, having grown up in South Africa, was constantly out in nature. Family would go on safari.
Right,
So it's something that I've been exposed to from a very young age. But for some reason, I jumped straight to street photography and architecture.
Yeah,
I think it was that world and that bubble that I was living in, and I sort of almost couldn't get out of it in a way. And one of the first times I went out to photograph landscapes was to go along the coast in North Berwick. And there's this giant rock out in the sea, Bass Rock, and it's got one of the largest gannet colonies in the UK.
Okay.
And it's just this really beautiful coastline, no one there, in sort of midwinter in Scotland, freezing cold.
That sounds blissful.
Yeah, exactly. And I got the bug, and from then on it was pretty much almost every weekend I was looking like, oh, can I go there?
Yeah, sure.
There? Go out to just 30 minutes outside of Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And you're in beautiful parts of the country.
So that was your first landscape photograph, was that rock?
Yeah, one of those.
How does that stand in your portfolio now?
It's buried all the way down in the deepest depths of my life catalog.
But pretty special meaning to it, though.
Yeah, for sure. I think the experience was potentially more meaningful than the resulting image.
Sure.
In a lot of ways, the images that I was making at that point were probably quite heavily influenced by just, what I had seen on Instagram or whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't have a particular creative vision in a way.
Yeah.
I was also shooting black and white film, which was potentially quite unique for someone just starting out.
Yeah.
But that was what I learned on. So it was almost like a bit of a default to go back to that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a wonderful learning tool for sure.
Yeah.
Teaches you about light, teaches you about being quite restrained and slow in your process, and being thoughtful through your compositions, not obviously only have so many frames on roll.
Yeah. And shape as well, which is quite strong in your work, isn't it? Shape and patterns.
Yeah, patterns, form, and the way light interacts with those things.
Yeah. I had a question to go back to actually, and it was that moment on the beach, looking at the rock and being alone. Was that Murray there, as opposed to maybe a version of Murray that existed in the university and society? And did you feel like you found maybe a part of you that was missing when you went out there?
I think potentially it was maybe a rediscovery.
Yeah.
Something that was there previously that I had lost through those sort of 3-ish years.
Yeah.
And something that's always been there.
Yeah. Because you mentioned you were brought up around nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we've been going to safari as a family for years and years back home in South Africa. So, and my grandpa was a big bird watcher, so he's part of that on us as well. So I mean, everything nature has always been something that brings me joy.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a connection to a bigger sense of where you fit in the world, or where you fit in the world.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the main thing.
Yeah.
It's like
feeling of belonging, perhaps.
I don't know if it necessarily belonging, but certainly just where do you fit in the puzzle of everything that's going on?
Yeah.
And I think when you sort of start to understand that, then you can think, how do I have a positive impact?
Yeah.
Because you understand that everybody and everything has a role to play.
Yeah, sure.
In the order of things, right?
Yeah.
And your actions and thoughts and everything do matter.
Absolutely. Every single thought and interaction and communication via eye contact and body language, and it all has an effect on everybody around us. Yeah. And going back to, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but the idea of changing who we are as a way of changing the world around us, and those are the interactions that we have that make a hopefully positive impact on everybody. So I'm intrigued, Murray, about the versions of Murray that exists now compared to the version of Murray that existed maybe back in those university days. And how do you see yourself now compared to then, and how much has nature changed you as a person? And creativity, of course.
So, potentially quite a difficult question to put into words.
Yeah.
And express with words. I would say I'm definitely more in touch with myself.
Yeah.
And am able to sort of register emotions and how I'm feeling, and really sort of connect with those in the moment.
Yeah.
Nature has a funny way of sort of bringing your attention to what's happening.
Sure.
In the now.
Yeah.
Whether that's really horrible conditions that you're facing, or
whatever
it may be. that's a positive, definitely big impact that nature's had on me.
Yeah.
And that's changed me in a big way.
Yeah.
I'd say, previously I was definitely someone who probably overthought things.
Yeah.
And now I'm able to, as you mentioned, sort of right in the beginning, sort of a bit more reactive.
Yeah.
A bit more easygoing.
Yeah, sure. Definitely changed us in a big way, I think. Yeah. What about creativity as a whole? Has creativity helped you in terms of maybe expressing different parts of yourself and giving you a more well-rounded view of yourself, perhaps?
I don't know if I've necessarily become more creative as a photographer versus as an architect.
Yeah.
There's always something that, even before university, I studied art and stuff in high school.
Yeah.
So creativity has always been part of who I am.
Sure.
And I think maybe photography is probably or I found a better way to express myself.
Yeah.
Or to be creative. Like for instance, studying art in school, doing painting, is something that I could never it didn't connect with me.
Yeah.
I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
Architecture, I was pretty good at that.
Yeah.
But photography, is something that ended up resonating more with.
Yeah.
I don't know why that was versus architecture. I think
Yeah.
it's something of a more intimate moment, perhaps, where you're creating a one-on-one connection with something in the real world, versus imagining, a building or something that you're trying to create.
Sure.
And I guess maybe that's potentially also why I never connected with painting myself. Trying to sort of force something out onto a blank canvas to me always felt really, really difficult. Whereas I think with photography, I like working within constraints, and I find, for putting a composition together is something that gives me some constraints, and I like that problem-solving aspect of things.
Sure. Yeah.
That's probably quite a big part of my personality in a way.
Yeah. Okay. So it's almost a blend of the logical mind and the kind of creative mind. Whereas maybe would architecture perhaps have been a little bit more towards the logical, not so.
In a way, yeah, because obviously you got to make buildings stand up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it kind of depends what school you go to in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Going to Edinburgh, they were very focused on creativity and the artistic side of things. There were only a couple modules where you studied sort of the physics of things and did the math behind structures and whatnot. And I think that's why I ended up enjoying or going to that school, was because I liked the creative focus. Yeah.
Yeah. So creativity's always been a part of you, yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
Going back to the actual photography now, what you mentioned to me earlier that maybe there'd be a little bit more colour coming into your work. Was that something you're thinking of doing? Yeah.
I think, certainly as an artist, I've gone through sort of ebbs and flows and waves of where you think, this is really working, I'm going to follow this train of thought and really delve into it and explore that idea. Yeah. And black and white has been that for me for the last, however long, 4 or 5 years. Yeah. And it's, in a way, being able to abstract things to a certain extent by stripping the colour out has allowed me to be metaphoric or poetic to some extent with some of my photographs, to try and bring meaning into them. And recently, I think I've felt as though sometimes working with black and white can be overly restrictive in the conditions that you shoot in. Sure. Like, I find it really difficult to photograph in, say, very soft light and blue hour. But it's something that I absolutely love doing, because I love the peace and calm of being up first thing in the morning and being the only one out there. Yeah. So, to me, the sort of aesthetic and end result of a colour photograph in those conditions better expresses the experiences and emotions that I felt when I was out there versus a black and white image. Yeah. That, when you look at that, you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether it was shot just on a very flat day in the middle of the day or at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. Yeah. So colour is definitely something I'm exploring. Yeah. And it's been super interesting so far. Yeah. Sort of drip feeded a little bit.
Yeah, I've noticed a few.
Out onto my Instagram and submitted a few to a couple competitions.
Oh yeah.
Just
how
to
did
see
they go off, do you know?
I've not heard back. It's sort of, what is it? Halfway through the judging process.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I've got a few that have made it through the first few stages. Yeah. But we'll see how it goes from there.
Do you have a preference?
Colour or black and white?
Yeah.
Definitely black and white. Yeah. I don't know if it's because I've trained myself to sort of see the world in that way. Yeah. Or probably a little bit is that because I've done that for so long. But being able to abstract things in a way where you can suggest the other and have something that's a little bit more abstract. Yeah. I think you've got a little bit more room there to sort of tweak things, add a bit of your own creativity. Hopefully come up with something a bit more unique.
Yeah. I'm excited to see the new direction or how the direction evolves. How would you say your style, your vision, how would you say it has evolved over the time you've been doing photography? What's been the process between the beginning and now?
I think it's something where a lot of subtle changes add up.
Yeah,
make
sure.
A difference.
Yeah.
Just becoming more technically astute with post-processing, I think has really evolved how my images look quite a lot. Initially, I was super into heavy contrast, really deep, rich blacks. Yeah. And I still like that, but I think sort of the evolution of being able to achieve that in a more refined way is sort of how I've ended up where I am now. Yeah. Yeah.
With that process, has that happened in stages for you, would you say? Like blocks?
To some extent, but I think that's sort of a result of how I end up sort of structuring my year and how I go out and produce work. Yeah. I tend to sort of go on several longer trips where I go and spend 2 months out on location in Scotland. Sure. And really immerse myself in a location. Yeah. Whether that's Torridon or out on the Ashen Hebrides. Yeah. That's the way that I like to work. So what ends up happening is I'll end up with a backlog of sort of 2,000, 3,000 images. And then when I get back, I'll spend a month and work through that catalogue slowly. Right. Processing, printing, doing reviews, looking at the collection as a whole, as well as individual images. Yeah. I think working in sort of almost in projects in a way. Yeah, sure. Has been something that's been pretty transformative for me. Yeah. Trying to stitch stories together across multiple images and the way that those images are sequenced has a big impact on that. Yeah. Really working in, I guess it is sort of working in stages. Yeah. It's almost like a step function.
Sure, yeah.
When you get back and you've made all those images, working through them and the act of making provides me with sort of artistic growth. Yeah, yeah. I think sitting at home and thinking about stuff. Yeah,
drive you mad.
You come up with some ideas potentially. Yeah. But actually getting out there and going and doing it.
Absolutely.
Having the experiences, making the photographs. Yeah. Making connections with people that you meet out on location.
Learning, growing, evolving all the time, because everything we're subjected to is a way of evolving our vision and artistic kind of stories, if you like. And I've certainly been a little bit guilty, particularly I'd guess over the last year, of probably sitting and probably reflecting a little bit too much and using the written word to make sense of myself, my life, my photography, my art. And I think sometimes being photographers, we're communicating via our works, aren't we? And like you say, sometimes it's best just to be out there, to shoot, to learn, to grow, and to let things evolve.
I guess it's a double-edged sword, because there's the practicalities of needing to, potentially if you're wanting to do this full-time, which I am, is wanting to earn a living from that.
Yeah.
So to some extent, you've got to share that and put the work out there. But on the other side, if you had the luxury of being able to spend 5 years just working and developing and
yeah, that's a dream there.
You'd come out the other end probably having made a lot more growth than if you had to spend half or more of that time working on sort of like the business side of things.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're shouting out to any benefactors and patrons. I think right now, aren't we? You were just going to let us go live in Scotland for 5 years.
Yeah, please.
Well, you mentioned that, and my head immediately just went into dream mode, and I was like, wow, imagine 5 years of just purely. That would be quite incredible. But I do love to sit and write and make sense of things, as you do as well. And how big a part of that process is the written word for you. Would you be, do you think, in the same place that you're at now without having written? And
no, absolutely not. I think certainly every gallery release that I try to do has a written component to it.
Yeah.
I think there's a powerful combination of word and image.
Yeah.
And putting those two things together, it completely transforms, because people go from the written word back to the image. Or maybe they look at the image first, think of whatever their first reaction is, then they read the caption of the essay that you accompanied it with, and suddenly there's a whole new context that they're now bringing back to the image.
Sure.
And that's something that I really like to sort of play with, is the balance and how those two things go together.
Yeah.
And the written word and writing essays about photography.
Yeah. It's certainly been cathartic for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I mentioned to you, I sort of almost a little bit struggle with.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time and energy for me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's an activity that gives me energy. I would say it's something that's sort of almost a little bit draining.
Yeah, sure.
But also in a good way.
Yeah, sure. Because the feelings when you mentioned when you hit publish are just relieving. Yeah. And I guess that you've managed to, take all of this stuff and streamline it into somewhere that gives that wider context, and maybe raises. You mentioned that you like the idea of other people maybe receiving something from your work and giving them feeling. I feel like the written word can certainly add so much more than just a photograph of somebody in terms of the questions that it raises within themselves about their own lives. And maybe I think we all need a conflicting and contrasting views sometimes, to grow, to learn, and I think the written word definitely does that for people.
Absolutely. I think that's super important to, one of the things I've been working on is, rather than trying to answer questions with my essays or with my photography, is to pose questions.
Yeah, sure.
I think using your essays and your photography as a way to start a conversation with people has been something that's been really powerful.
Sure. Yeah.
At least it's something I've been focusing on probably for the last maybe 6 months to a year.
Okay. Yeah.
As sort of like a new
way
of working.
Very similar to myself. Yeah. Same kind of time frames. Mm-hmm. And you said you've been photographing for, did you say 5 years?
I would say seriously, probably 3 years.
Okay, yeah.
But I mean, I've been dabbling with a camera since I was, 12 or something.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm 28 now.
Yeah.
So I've always had a camera nearby, but seriously with landscape photography and also with wildlife, which I do.
Yeah. Okay.
Very occasionally, but when I get the chance.
Yeah.
Pretty much since lockdown, since COVID.
Yeah. Interesting how you've progressed to writing as well, and I think it's something a lot of photographers gravitate towards eventually in their journeys. Maybe as we're all trying to make sense of ourselves and our bodies at work, and like you said, give back to other people. And I think there is a beauty in certainly in opening conversations with questions and thoughts, rather than maybe, telling people you need to be outdoors in nature. And I've certainly observed plenty of people through my life who try and, throw things at people and tell people how they should live. But from my experience, it's not the way to make any change.
And I mean, those people aren't going to get the most out of if you force them out into nature. the a willing participant is always going to be have a more valuable time than somebody who's
you're dragging them out with their arms around their back and shoving their face in their mouth, saying, "Look at that flower! I appreciate that flower." Not the way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, Murray, what is it that drives you to keep going with this pursuit? And I'll give you a little bit more context. It's quite a dysfunctional pursuit, I find, to go and stand out there in the rain, in the snow, crack of dawn, middle of nowhere. There's something in us that makes us do it, and it comes from a deeper place, I find, and I'm wondering where yours comes from.
Yeah, I guess you described a few experiences there, whereas those are probably quite endorphin filling. You get a bit of a rush from some of those experiences for sure, and other times it's a little bit quieter, more calm and peaceful. And I think it's that space to think and just be, and not have to worry about everything that's going on in the world. I'm hesitant to describe it as a bit of an escape. I don't think that's really the right word, but it's sort of in that realm of things. It's where I go to get solitude. Maybe that's a little bit better way to express it.
Sure, place to go to be yourself and to be in tune, I'm also going to add to that, you mentioned the experiences of the peace, and I also have the days where I'm out there and I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing here? Why have I hiked all this way? And I'm constantly fighting this, not constantly, but on certain days. There was one particular day where I'd gone down to Devon, and I'd planned myself a 5 or 6 mile hike along the coastline, like a circular walk, and I was up high, probably 50, 60 metres up above the sea, and I'm looking down this cliff and looking out at the sea, and the rain is coming in sideways, upside down sometimes, it's going up my nose and all sorts. And I'm just on this cliff top, and it's grey, miserable of course, and I'm thinking, I haven't got the drive to create any photos. I'm feeling miserable. I was in my own head thinking, what is the point of being out here? And I wonder if that's something you face sometimes as well, that inner, whatever it is trying to hold us back perhaps.
In some ways, I think you almost described the answer to the question as going out there and having to ask yourself those hard questions, is part of the answer.
Sure, yeah.
It's a place where going out into nature forces you to ask yourself the hard questions and get real.
Yeah.
And nature sometimes provides the answer.
Yeah.
Whether it is that, you come through that hell of a storm and you come out the other side and you think, I can get through anything.
Yeah, sure.
If I can get through that, I can get through that. And I think part of that for me is that the images don't necessarily come first.
Yes.
It's going out and the experience is the primary goal.
Yeah.
So bringing it back to the expectations thing, if you go out with no expectations, then you're always going to have an experience no matter what. And so I know that every time I go out, there's going to be something that I can take away.
Yeah, sure. So would you say a lot of the key for you is the growth that comes alongside this venture, the experiences, the things you can sit back and learn from to make yourself a better human being, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time either.
No, it doesn't, you're right.
It's probably more of a rare occurrence, actually. You have a special experience or something, or a really hard one.
Yeah.
Most of the time, it's pretty constant, though.
Pretty steady.
Yeah, steady up.
Yeah.
I love those days. They're certainly the ones that give me the most to think about, and I still think about that day now. It's the beginning of the year, and it still comes up in thought every now and then when I'm maybe feeling a lack of gratitude for life, and I think I've been here before, and the sitting and reflecting process that night actually brought a lot of that to mind, where I was really kind of like, I should be grateful for this. I get to go out and I get to share my experiences with the world and people who, you accrue people who are following you and following your story, and I found within myself this feeling of I really need to appreciate that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's gratitude and appreciation is super important.
Yeah,
because I think being able to have a creative life and lead a creative life is to some extent quite a privilege.
Yeah.
A lot of people just don't have it. It's not an option for them.
Sure.
At least in the way that we're doing it. I think you can have a creative life in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Whether it is just creating a meal for your family or there's lots of ways that people express themselves in day-to-day life. So to have a creative life where that is what we do, day in, day out, that's a real privilege.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the idea that you just posed there where, some people are creative in the way they cook a meal for their family. Because I've certainly been guilty, I think, since discovering this part of myself 5-6 years ago that, enjoyed creativity, enjoyed expression. I proclaimed that creativity was purely, painting, photographing, writing, but actually creativity comes in all kinds of different forms and shapes, and electricians can be creative, builders can be creative,
Yeah, and it can be more esoteric than that as well. It could be just, a new idea that you thought of and you start a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
I define that as a form of creation. You brought something into the world that didn't exist beforehand.
Sure.
Where it becomes really interesting is if those creative ideas are unique and new and novel. That's when you start to really push the boundaries of things.
Sure. The more abstract, the better. And I think those come from the more abstract life experiences, don't they? Really. Yeah. Hence why I kind of posed the question to you before about some of your life experiences and to see maybe what shaped your abstract ways of thinking and vision, because I feel like anybody creating is creating from a place of, something in my life has forced me to this place where I'm trying to see differently and share these different ideas. I feel like photographers particularly have had some pretty unique life experiences that have pushed them towards this place.
Yeah, and then the challenge becomes how do you communicate those through your photographs to other people.
Yes.
So I think that's where most of my creative energy goes into trying to think of how an image conveys a certain idea or experience. Often it's that more abstract meaning that you're trying to bring to a photograph.
Yeah.
For instance, we were talking about the image at the top of the mountain earlier. And one of the sort of things that I tried to view in that photograph was sort of almost a sense of like wilderness, which is sort of maybe a bit of a conflicting idea with Scotland, which is where maybe I need to, as part of the project, bring in some essays and words. Scotland sort of got this weird thing where everybody thinks it's very wild, but actually a lot of the landscape is managed for deer hunting.
Sure.
And also they do a process called muir burning.
Called what? Muir?
Muir burning, from John Muir.
Yeah.
Where they burn the landscape to bring fresh growth, so the deer have new food to eat.
Okay.
It's quite an old, sort of a very old, almost an old farming technique.
Yeah.
But the landscape, unfortunately, has suffered from that. So I sort of, when I'm bringing ideas to photographs like that, there are times where, that experience felt wild. I was out on the top of the mountain, epic conditions, etc. And then you put that into your photograph, but the reality doesn't necessarily link up with the idea that you're trying to portray.
Yeah.
So that's where the words and writing can come in to bring a bit of nuance to that conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
That maybe you can't convey just purely through a single photograph.
Yeah. Because a photograph can often just be, you can make anywhere look like anything, can't you, as an artist? But actually, the truth behind it, like you mentioned, is often relatively different. And I think especially with the intimate stuff, I know there's a few scenes that I've photographed that certainly I've made look wild for the sake of trying to do Mother Nature justice, but actually the context of it is a lot of them are in places that are managed or farmland or parks, for example.
I mean, that's kind of beautiful in itself, though, that as an artist you can find those things anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
That even in, for instance, a puddle on the side of the road.
Yeah.
Could probably make quite an interesting water abstract.
Yeah.
Using really long
Maybe we'll go out and try it
lines.
around Montgomery afterwards.
Yeah,
see
absolutely.
what we can come up with. So you mentioned about the perhaps evolution of your vision, maybe including a lot more colour work, and I wonder if there are any other kind of ideas that you're bringing to your work, and if there's any themes that you might want to include, and perhaps what differences would you like your work to make in the future as well.
I think one of the themes we sort of just touched on with the Scottish landscape is trying to add that. I mean, it's almost semi-political, sort of climate change and the way that the Scottish landscape is managed. And in a lot of ways, using a colour image, I feel as though that might bring a sense of reality that makes it feel as though those issues are real and they're on the ground.
Sure, yeah.
Where a black and white image, people have that sort of one step of separation from.
Sure.
So there's a constant balance there between wanting the pieces to feel like art versus wanting to portray a message of action or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I guess that's part of the struggle of photography in a lot of ways, is that it's one of the only unique or art forms that's inherently tied to reality.
Sure.
Painting, it's coming from the mind and you're making something appear out of nowhere.
Sure.
Photography, you're literally recording light.
Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of maybe part of the struggle that photography has had.
Definitely,
as being seen as an art form.
Sure.
It's people just see it as like, you're just recording what's already there.
It's just a place, and it's a time.
So I think there's a careful balance there, and some sort of mix of colour and black and white to me feels like maybe it's going to strike a balance of having the black and white, which I feel is maybe a little bit more artistic.
Sure.
For lack of a better
Yeah.
descriptor, and the colour images that bring a bit more, hard reality.
So would you say that's a potential difference that you would maybe like to make or like to see photography make? Is that maybe would you like to see it accepted as more of an art form and appreciated as more of an art form, perhaps?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it is slightly regional, and things change depending on who you ask and everything.
Yeah.
It's definitely a struggle in the UK for sure. And it's great, we're sitting here in your exhibition right now.
Yeah.
So it's great to see this sort of thing happening in smaller local areas.
Yeah.
And, all of these people hopefully getting some good feedback here.
Yeah, absolutely. This one has been pretty quiet for the last 2 days because of the floods, but I ran one here back in May, and it was very well received actually from the locals here in Montgomery and the wider area as well. I actually had one comment about one piece of work, and not just one piece of work, but photography as a whole, which kind of triggered the idea for the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And a lady made a minor comment about photography perhaps not being classed on the same level as art, right? Painters, and I challenged her, and I kind of said, so are you actually implying that photography isn't art then? And she kind of took a step back, and I think she realised, I wasn't offended, but I was curious, and I was just trying to explore her thought process that was just unconscious, I guess. And it really opened up a fascinating conversation, actually. Hence why I wanted to ask you the same kind of question as well.
I think it's pretty hard to argue when you see something on the wall beautifully framed like this, that it's not art. Maybe, you know, if you just sit all day on Instagram, your perception of photography might change to the other side of things.
Yeah.
But I think as soon as you see something in person, it's like, wow, that's, of course that's art. And, you know, larger galleries also have a role to play in the conversation.
Yeah.
There was actually a great exhibition that I recently went to at Tate Modern in London, where it was basically the conversation between painting and photography.
Oh, really? Wow.
And how actually pretty much all of the photographers in the exhibit, all of the painters in the exhibit, used photography for their painting. So it sort of nullified the whole thing of, well, where's the separation?
Yeah. There is none. We're all the same. And I've certainly had messages from painters before saying, you know, love your photograph. Can I use it as a inspiration and a sample for my painting? So the one would not exist without the other. So there certainly is artistic merit. And I'd be, you know, I'd be annoyed if we weren't recognised as artists, to be honest, in the wider world. And I know it's subjective, and some people will and some people won't, but overall I'm thinking I'd love to see more respect, I guess, placed upon photographers.
I think that might shift in the next sort of generation or two. Obviously, with everybody now having smartphones, I think it's become a more ubiquitous part of life. And you know, people who potentially didn't grow up with smartphones might have that viewpoint. Yeah. And younger generations, I don't think will hold the viewpoint that photography is not.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe we're ahead of our time.
Yeah.
Hopefully so. So where would Murray be without photography and without nature, of course, as well?
I don't know if I'd be around, man. Without nature? Come on.
Without photography, then.
Probably working in London.
Yeah.
Or for an architecture firm.
Wow.
I mean, coming out of university, I had interviews and stuff with some really good practices. Literally, I had one interview, and coming out the other side of it, I was like, I can't do it.
Really? Yeah.
I really, really can't do it. So that was sort of, I guess, the moment.
Yeah.
So
the awakening moment.
Yeah. Or just, you know, the decision.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna go for it.
Yeah.
And so be an urban existence.
Certainly not on your way up to Scotland right now for a month-long road trip.
Yeah.
That's going to be beautiful. I'm excited to see what you managed to produce.
Thank you. Yeah.
And
the joke in my family was always that if I wasn't going to be an architect, then I'd be a game ranger.
Oh, what? Sorry.
A game ranger. Basically, somebody who leads safaris.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, plan B has always been something to do with nature.
Yeah. Murray, thanks for coming on. I'm delighted to have had this conversation with you.
Absolutely. So glad to have met you.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Brilliant.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in to this week's episode of the podcast. It was a beautiful conversation with UK-based landscape photographer Murray Livingston. I'm sure that you gained plenty of valuable insights and, you know, maybe the conversation raised questions inside of yourself. I'd love to hear from you if it did, and if you feel like you've grown and developed from this conversation, then please do let me know. Send me a message, leave me a comment, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to help me grow and share these messages that I have for the world. I'm on a bit of a mission to, you know, raise the profile of photography, of photographers, and share my message about, you know, what photography can do for the human soul, not just within myself, but within my guests as well, who I'm very grateful for, you know, for their opening up and sharing their own personal stories and their own personal quests. It's been an incredible journey so far. I'm episode 9 now, and I can't believe how quickly we're flying through these. I'm looking forward to bringing you many more conversations with photographers in the future. If you're interested in learning from me, don't forget that we have upcoming workshops. Myself and Mark Robbins in 2024, we have a residential workshop and some one-day workshops in the spring. So you can head over to my website to find those. I'll also be releasing a host of one-day workshops in Snowdonia, in Mid Wales, and maybe even further afield next year. So if you're interested in those, then please do subscribe to my newsletter and stay up to date with all developments on my side. Ladies and gents, thank you once again, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye for now.